Just a minute. I'm going to go up here on time. Usually I am, so just give me one Thanks to everyone for coming. The Facebook matter involving Alexander Kogan and Cambridge Analytica shed a bright light on the data practices of some of our largest technology companies. Although advertisers and political campaigns have collected and used data for years, the public seemed generally unaware. This story has forced both the public and lawmakers to confront serious issues that need to be addressed, including what role Congress should play in promoting transparency for consumers regarding data collection and use, while ensuring a well-functioning marketplace for our data-dependent technologies to drive further innovation. We started that conversation with Mr. Zuckerberg last month. I hope that today we can continue a productive and meaningful debate about these serious policy issues. Unfortunately, events like these, more often than not, seem to get muddled by partisanship and efforts to score a quick soundbite. The Facebook story first broke December 2015 because The Guardian identified that Dr. Kogan had allegedly transferred Facebook data to Cambridge Analytica in violation of Facebook's data policies. According to Cambridge press releases and a recent internal report in July 2016, Facebook requested Cambridge and its affiliates to remove any data received from Dr. Kogan. Cambridge said that they removed the data and filed legal certification to Facebook saying as much. I had requested that Cambridge Analytica appear at this hearing to explain these facts and tell their side of the story. Cambridge, however, recently commenced insolvency proceedings and therefore determined it could not participate in this hearing. The underlying story has not changed much since 2015, except for two important events. First, Cambridge began doing work for the Trump campaign, and secondly, President Trump won the 2016 election. These two facts sounded an alarm that revived the Cambridge story. This does not diminish the importance of this discussion, but only highlights the extreme partisanship at play, and more importantly, that this conversation could have easily taken place in 2015. In fact, this conversation could have taken place much earlier. Advertising agencies and political campaigns have utilized data analytic tools for many years. Campaigns, including those of presidential candidates in every election year since at least the 1990s, use data to micro-target. During the past 3 presidential elections, these strategies have expanded to social media platforms, specifically Facebook. President Obama's campaign developed an app utilizing the same Facebook feature that Cambridge used to capture the information of not just the app's users, but also millions of their friends. President Obama's app potentially pulled even more information than Cambridge's app. A former Obama campaign official, Carol Davison, recently wrote, quote, Facebook was surprised that we were able to suck out the whole social graft, end of quote, in the 2012 election. We could also be talking about more recent events, like BuzzFeed's partnering with multiple Democratic and anti-Trump super PACs in 2016. In a 2016 interview, BuzzFeed's vice president of politics and advocacy said that one of the problems BuzzFeed was working with other partners to solve was, quote, how are we going to get women who do not like Hillary Clinton to vote for her, end of quote. That type of voter outreach is not surprising to many. That's because it happens all the time. Similarly, it shouldn't be surprising that President Trump's campaign used consultants to help reach voters as well. Regardless of these events and whether such tactics are actually effective, it is clear that the use of data across the political spectrum is only increasing. And so, instead of just treating this as a partisan issue to score political points, the important policy discussion should really have is whether tech, consumer, and Congress, where we should go from here. Our tech companies have access to some of our most sensitive data. Are these companies doing enough to properly disclose their data policies and protect their user data? Many of the services offered by such tech companies provide huge benefits to consumers at little to no cost. Are consumers blissfully unaware, or are they making informed choices with respect to how their data is collected and used? In 2015, the U.S. consumer technology sector directly provided 4 7/10 million jobs and generated 1 9/10 trillion in output, 435 billion in labor income, and 192 billion in tax payments. How do we ensure the proper amount of regulation to protect consumers without damaging an industry that has been vital to the economy? These are the questions we should be asking. I hope today's hearing will allow us to continue that discussion. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. In March of this year, a series of articles and videos were published online regarding Cambridge Analytica and its efforts to use personal Facebook data of millions of Americans to influence United States elections. To date, numerous governments have launched formal investigations into the company, including the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Nigeria, Kenya, and India. There is much we do not know about Cambridge Analytica, but there are significant facts already in the public record. We know that Cambridge Analytica was established by Robert and Rebecca Mercer in 2013 at the urging of former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon as an American subsidiary of a London-based firm, SCL Group. It has been reported that the intent of creating an American shell was to give the appearance of compliance with United States election law that prohibits foreigners from working on United States elections. According to CEO Alexander Nix, Cambridge Analytica worked for candidates in 44 United States elections in 2014. During the 2016 election cycle, Mr. Nix stated that Cambridge Analytica, and I quote, did all the research, all the data, all the analytics, all the targeting, end quote. We ran all of the digital campaign, the television campaign, and our data informed all the strategy for the Trump campaign. In addition, Cambridge Analytica obtained detailed personal information on approximately 87 million people from Facebook without their knowledge. The massive data set, which reportedly included approximately 4,000 data points on each individual, was used by Cambridge Analytica and SCL Canada to develop a comprehensive voter targeting an online behavioral influence tool called Project Ripon. Reportedly, Project Ripon was a software program that used sophisticated algorithms to allow campaigns to segment voters into groups based on psychological characteristics, such as neurotic or introverted. Once individuals were identified and grouped, the platform then provided pre-selected and focused group-tested images and keywords that were most likely to alter the behavior of those individuals. Examples of the messages developed and used by Cambridge Analytica included keywords such as drain the swamp and deep state, as well as images of border walls. In an undercover video, Cambridge Analytica Managing Director Mark Turnbull explained that Cambridge Analytica also created the brand Defeat Crooked Hillary. The company then created hundreds of different online advertisements for that brand, including online videos that were viewed 30 million times. Through Project Ripon, selected images were then sent to the relevant individuals through online advertising services like Google and Facebook. These websites provided feedback on an individual's reactions to those advertisements, which were then fed automatically back into the targeting program. This is what we've learned in the past several months. However, significant questions remain, and there's much we still do not know about Cambridge Analytica. We do not know the extent to which it worked with hackers to illegally obtain damaging information on candidates, including the United States. It was reported in 2015 that Cambridge Analytica's parent company facilitated the hacking and theft of sensitive medical records from a Nigerian presidential candidate and published them online. We do not know whether Cambridge Analytica used these tactics in the United States, but this pattern of activity was certainly used by Russian intelligence during the 2016 election. We do not know the extent of Cambridge Analytica's connections to WikiLeaks and other Russian interests. It has been reported that Alexander Nix contacted WikiLeaks in June of 2016. Mr. Nix has said this was his only contact with WikiLeaks. However, his former partner, Mr. Nigel Oakes, has suggested that Cambridge Analytica's first contact with Julian Assange was between 12 and 18 months prior. It has also been reported that other employees at Cambridge Analytica had direct connections to Mr. Assange, including through Assange's former attorney. In 2016, Alexander Nix also provided white papers and briefings to executives from Lukoil, Russia's second largest oil firm, about Cambridge Analytica's political activities in the United States. Lukoil is currently under United States sanctions related to the Russian government's activities in the Ukraine. And in March 2017, Lukoil revealed its formal information sharing partnership with the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, the successor to the KGB. Finally, we still do not know whether the data obtained by Cambridge Analytica was ever shared with or obtained by a third party. The data was originally obtained through a Facebook application developed by a Russian-born professor named Alexander Kogan. Professor Kogan maintains a teaching position at St. Petersburg University in Russia, a state-funded institution, and has traveled frequently back and forth to Russia. These are concerning questions, not only for the United States, but for all democracies around the world. Based on what we have already learned, there is no question that the future of data privacy will have a significant impact on every aspect of our lives, including our basic constitutional rights. Today, we're going to hear testimony from Christopher Wylie, who served as research director at Cambridge Analytica from June of 2013 until November of 2014. I understand he will be able to share insight into some of these significant questions based on his firsthand experience. So I very much look forward to hearing from Mr. Wylie, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
I'm now going to introduce our witnesses, and after I do that, I would ask you to stand and be sworn. It was our intention, Senator Feinstein and I, to come down and shake hands with you and welcome you. I'm sorry that everything was clogged here, so we didn't want to mess everything up, but both of us want to thank you for participating, and particularly you, Mr. Wylie, coming as far as you have to help us with proper testimony. Our first witness is Dr. Eitan Hersh. Dr. Hersh is an associate professor at Tufts University focusing on American politics. He spent 7 years as an assistant professor at Yale University. He is a nationally published author. He earned a PhD degree and master's degree in political science from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree from Tufts. Next person. Besides thanking you, we welcome you to this hearing, and hopefully you feel comfortable and everything. I know you've testified elsewhere. Christopher Wylie is a former director of research at Cambridge Analytica. Mr. Wylie worked with President Obama's campaign for the Canadian Liberal Party and for the United Kingdom's Liberal Democratic Party. From 2013 to 2014, he worked for Cambridge Analytica while also studying for a PhD in fashion trending forecasting. He has an undergraduate degree in law from the London School of Economics. Lastly, Dr. Mark Jamieson is a visiting scholar at American Enterprise Institute. He's also the director and Gunter Professor of Public Utility Research Center, University of Florida's Warrington College of Business. Dr. Jamieson earned a PhD in economics from Warrington College of Business at the University of Florida and a master's and bachelor's degree from Kansas State University. So would you three stand now, please? Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. All have affirmed. And so we'll start with Professor Hersh, and then Mr. Wylie, and then Dr. Jamieson.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to learn with you today about this important issue.
Stop just a minute. We may have to do something with your microphone. Talk again and see if it's the same.
Can you hear me?
Is it okay?
It makes it appear you have a frog in your throat.
Oh.
I know.
Is there anything here we have another person coming with another microphone. We've had this happen before, so it's not you. And kind of pull it as close as you can. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you again for inviting me here to learn with you on this important issue of technology.
It doesn't work.
No?
Could you, what? Okay, we have to turn it on here, is what I'm told.
Turn it on and off again. There we go.
Thanks.
Okay, good?
Good.
Thank you. The controversy surrounding Cambridge Analytica and Facebook has raised a number of serious concerns: foreign interference in US elections, the personal privacy of Facebook users, and Cambridge Analytica's voter targeting strategies. My expertise is on civic engagement, personal data, and voter targeting, and I hope to be able to answer questions you have in these areas. Let me briefly summarize a few points from my written testimony. Every election brings exaggerated claims about the effects of the latest technologies. After an election, there is always a demand to figure out why the winning campaign won, and the latest technology used by the winning campaign is often a good storyline, even if it's false. Campaign consultants also have a business interest in appearing to offer special skills and products, and so they often embellish their role to the media. Cambridge Analytica was relatively new to the scene in 2016, and it promoted new strategies of psychographic targeting to persuade voters. From everything I've seen publicly disclosed about Cambridge Analytica, I am skeptical of the idea that its strategies of voter persuasion were unusually effective or contributed meaningfully to the election outcome. To understand why, it's useful to divide a campaign strategy into mobilization and persuasion. Mobilization entails finding supporters and encouraging them to vote. Persuasion entails encouraging voters to support your candidate. Compared to mobilization, persuasion is very, very hard, and Facebook data or data from other sources doesn't help very much. Let me explain why. First, persuasion effects decay rapidly. Research has shown that an ad may change a voter's mind for a fleeting moment, but the effect goes away amidst all the other ads, news, posts, and stimuli that accompany an election season. Second, persuasion is hard because it is actually very hard, even with top-notch data, to figure out which voters are persuadable. The reason for this is no person is persuadable all the time. Persuadability isn't a stable disposition. You might be persuadable now but not tomorrow, by one kind of message or messenger but not another. Third, persuasion's hard because when you try to figure out who is persuadable, your predictions of who is persuadable are often wrong. They're imperfect. And you end up sending targeted messages to the wrong population. For example, campaigns often want to predict the racial identity of a voter. Predictions of which voters are Black or Hispanic are wrong about 25% of the time. So when a campaign sends a message targeted to these voters, a quarter of the people receiving the message will be mistargeted. Research suggests that voters penalize candidates who mistarget them. And if campaigns get race wrong a quarter of the time, they're going to have much, much more error in estimating something nuanced, like a personality, how extroverted or neurotic you are based on your Facebook likes, which is what Cambridge Analytica claimed to be doing. The idea that Cambridge Analytica could use Facebook likes to predict personalities, then use those predictions to effectively target ads, strikes me as implausible given what we know about the challenges of persuasion in campaigns. No evidence has been produced publicly about the firm's profiling or targeting to suggest that its efforts were effective or that it overcame the difficulties in persuasion that I just articulated. In spite of my skepticism, there is a lot we do not know about how campaigns are using social media to target voters. This controversy gives us some anxiety, in part because we don't really know where the line is between ads attempting to persuade voters and ads attempting to manipulate or deceive voters. This anxiety is all the more understandable because Facebook hasn't really taken seriously its solemn civic role as a facilitator of news and political communications. In my written testimony, I describe an initiative currently underway by which independent researchers can measure the effects of Facebook ad targeting and news sharing. The success of this program depends on a serious commitment by Facebook to share its data, even and especially in cases that will bring negative press to the company. In raising skepticism about Cambridge Analytica, I do not at all mean to suggest that there aren't serious concerns stemming from this controversy related to privacy, foreign interference, and the troubling role of social media in transmitting news, information, and fake news and fake information. Rather, I hope we can focus on the more important of these issues as I discuss in my written testimony. Thank you again for your attention to the subject matter, and I welcome your questions.
Talk. All right, how's that? Good? Mr. Chairman, Senators, thank you for the opportunity to invite me to speak today. Cambridge Analytica is the canary in the coal mine. We must address the digital echo chambers that are being exploited to algorithmically segregate American society. Online communities should unite us and not divide us. Data is the new electricity of our digital economy. And just like electricity, we cannot escape data. Online platforms' terms and conditions present users with a false choice because using the internet is no longer a choice. Americans cannot opt out of the 21st century. All revolutions throw up new power structures. The American Revolution required the Constitution to ensure that citizens of the young republic were protected from the excesses of arbitrary government. The Industrial Revolution required protections for workers against hazardous conditions in the workplace and in the environment. So too, with the digital revolution, must we realize that there is a new game being played, and that the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness need to be defended from those who might undermine them using new technologies, whether they are corporations, whether they are nations, or whether they are non-state actors. I've come here today voluntarily as a witness and as a whistleblower. I've already reported these matters to the authorities, and it should be made clear that I am not a target of these investigations. I was the director of research at SCL and Cambridge Analytica from mid-2013 to late 2014. SCL Group was a British military contractor specializing in information operations. Cambridge Analytica was created to allow SCL to work in the United States. Cambridge Analytica did not have any employed staff, and all of its clients were handled by SCL. Although lawyers warned about using foreign citizens, the firm installed a non-US citizen as its CEO and embedded non-US citizens in American campaigns. Cambridge Analytica offered voter disengagement services in the United States, and there are internal documents that I have seen that make reference to this tactic. My understanding was that this was targeted at African American voters. When I was at Cambridge Analytica, I was also made aware of the firm's black ops capacity. I have seen documents relating to instances where the firm sought to procure hacked material. Some of the targets of these special intelligence services are currently heads of state in various countries. I've also seen internal documents that make reference to the use of specialized intelligence services from former members of Israeli and Russian state security services. Of further concern is Cambridge Analytica's employment of people closely associated with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. In addition to making approaches to WikiLeaks, the firm hired 2 senior staff, both of whom were previously aides to the British lawyer representing Julian Assange. Cambridge Analytica sought to identify mental vulnerabilities in voters and worked to exploit them by targeting information designed to activate some of the worst characteristics in people, such as neuroticism, paranoia, and racial biases. To be clear, the work of Cambridge Analytica is not equivalent to traditional marketing. Cambridge Analytica specialized in disinformation, spreading rumors, compromat, and propaganda. For those who claim that profiling does not work, this contradicts copious amounts of peer-reviewed literature in top scientific journals. Even Facebook applied for a patent on, quote, determining user personality characteristics from social networking systems. Dr. Alexander Kogan was selected by Cambridge Analytica to lead the data harvesting operation, and over 80 million data subjects had their personal data misappropriated. Given this scale, this could be one of the largest breaches of Facebook's data. Cambridge Analytica contractors had also worked on pro-Russian political operations in Eastern Europe, including with suspected Russian intelligence agents. Cambridge Analytica set up focus groups and polling on Americans' views on the leadership of Vladimir Putin and Russian expansionism in Eastern Europe. Dr. Kogan was also working on Russian state-funded research projects. The Russian project at St. Petersburg was also building algorithms using Facebook data for psychological profiling and researched social media trolling. In fact, Cambridge Analytica pitched, quote, the interesting work Alex Kogan has been doing for the Russians, end quote, to his other clients. Cambridge Analytica also was in close contact with senior executives at Lukoil, one of Russia's largest oil companies. Cambridge Analytica presented Lukoil with documents outlining its experience with foreign disinformation, rumor campaigns, and its American data assets. Facebook knew about Cambridge Analytica's scheme since 2015. Before the story broke, Facebook threatened to sue The Guardian and then banned me for whistleblowing. Responding on behalf of the British government, the UK Secretary of State for Culture called my ban outrageous, because it reveals the unrestrained power technology companies can exercise over ordinary citizens when a person's entire online presence can be so quickly and so thoroughly eliminated from existence. There is no check on this power, and it raises a serious question for Republicans and Democrats alike. What happens to our democracy when these companies can delete people at will when they speak out? Mark Zuckerberg's continual refusal to cooperate with the British inquiry reveals the challenge that other countries face to hold companies like Facebook to account. The British Parliament is now considering a standing summons on Mr. Zuckerberg after Facebook refused and failed to answer 40 of their questions. The Cambridge Analytica scandal has exposed that social platforms are no longer safe for users. These platforms are a critical part of American cyberspace and are in desperate need of protection and oversight. I'm still optimistic about the future of technology, but we should not walk into the future blind, and it is the job of lawmakers to ensure that technology serves citizens and not the other way around. Thank you.
Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I can summarize my testimony in 3 sentences. First, using Facebook and other social media data in ways that are not transparent to users is not unusual in modern political activity. Second, Facebook's problems appear to result from a rapidly changing company allowing itself to drift from forming communities to serving advertisers and developers, not from a lack of regulation. Third, new regulations aimed at Facebook's errors are more likely to protect the business from competition than benefit consumers. Let me summarize my thoughts on each. The best known and probably most effective political use of Facebook and other data analytics were the national campaigns of President Barack Obama, so I'll focus there. These campaigns were uniquely capable at leveraging Facebook. Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes put together the new media strategy for Obama's U.S. Senate and 2008 presidential campaigns, and the 2012 campaign took things to a new level. The campaigns obtained Facebook data of supporters and their Facebook friends through Facebook apps, and by having supporters log into mybarackobama.com using their Facebook accounts. The 2012 campaign's tech team was reputed to be able to exploit Facebook capabilities before even Facebook knew those capabilities existed. One Facebook outreach program let supporters know if their close friends had not voted during an election and encouraged the supporters to contact those friends. This required intimate knowledge of supporters' Facebook friends and the nature of their relationships. Regarding Facebook's failings, the company's primary failure is not being clear and candid with its users. I distinguish between users, who are the subscribers, and the customers, who are those entities that buy ads and other services. For markets to perform well, users should have complete and understandable information on the nature of the services they're using, even those that have zero monetary price, as in the case of Facebook. This isn't happening. The company has changed how it serves and uses subscribers without ensuring that they fully understand. Facebook has morphed from a connector of communities to someone that investigates people's lives and filters their Facebook communications. The pivotal moment appears to be in 2007 when Facebook's growth stalled. From Facebook's beginning, adding users was a primary goal. The stall triggered the company to hire a team that, according to some of its former members, attempted to use psychological manipulation to increase users' time on Facebook. Since then, it seems fair to describe the company's business as gathering people into a context where they reveal information about themselves so that others can market products and ideas. In a sense, Facebook's users are its products. One of Facebook's methods for expanding its reach was the development of Newsfeed. Newsfeed changed Facebook yet again, making it into a discussion monitor, determining who's allowed a voice and who hears what voices on the platform. Facebook's shifts appear to be the case of a company allowing itself to drift. Each step over the years probably made sense by itself, but taken as a whole, they constitute a change in who the company is. Many businesses have gone down this road. When things go too far, competition steps in. I now turn my attention to my last point. New regulations are likely to harm Facebook users. There are 2 reasons. One is that the problems are business problems that commonly occur, so new regulations are unlikely to help. They won't be focused on the main issue. The second reason is that new regulations would likely serve to protect Facebook and other large internet companies from competition. The European Union's new General Data Protection Regulation is a case in point. The new regulations are driving some tech companies, especially small ones, out of Europe. Such regulations impede freedom, stifle innovation, and reduce competition. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thanks to everybody for your testimony, and we'll go to questions now, and we'll have 5-minute rounds for each individual. I'm going to start with Mr. Wylie. I think these will be easy questions for you, but listen while I lead up to them. You joined SCL Group, Cambridge Analytica Group of companies in June of 2013. In May of 2014, the group received Facebook data from Alexander Kogan. You stopped working for the group in July 2014. In early 2016, Facebook contacted the group and yourself and asked that Facebook data received from Mr. Kogan be deleted. In March of 2017, following an internal audit, the group certified it had purged all of Mr. Kogan's Facebook data from its servers. The group was retained by the Trump campaign in the summer of 2016. So these 3 questions that I think will be easy for you to answer. So SCL Cambridge had not been retained by the Trump campaign during your employment?
When I worked at Cambridge Analytica, the Trump campaign was not a client, no.
2, and you did not work for the Trump campaign while at SCL Cambridge?
I have never worked for the Trump campaign.
And you weren't there when the company made its certification to Facebook?
I was not in the company or engaged at the company when they had that dealing with Facebook, no.
Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Hirsch, there's been a lot of media attention around allegations that Cambridge Analytica helped President Trump improperly influence the 2016 election by utilizing data it received from Facebook. Cambridge claims that the Facebook data was ineffective, was deleted upon request from Facebook, and was not used in their work for the Trump campaign. If Cambridge, so my question, if Cambridge had kept and utilized the Facebook data, what impact do you think the organization like Cambridge Analytica and strategies which Mr. Wylie described, quote, as military-style information warfare, end quote, can have on influencing the outcome of an election given the kind of data it received from Facebook?
Thanks for the question. You know, as I said in my testimony, it is hard to move people. It's easier to mobilize or potentially demobilize people than to persuade people. But as I said, there hasn't been any evidence presented from Facebook or Cambridge Analytica, data that probably does exist that could answer this question. In other words, when Facebook ads are run or when companies like Cambridge Analytica run ads, they do so with experimentation. They have a control group and a treatment group, and they could know the answer to this question. So if these things were actually effective, I think Cambridge Analytica would know and Facebook would know. Based on what we've seen from public reports and from this history of targeting about why it's hard to move people, I'm skeptical of this data and these ads moving people in a substantial way.
Okay, Dr. Jabinson, the media has portrayed the Trump campaign use of data and firms like Cambridge Analytica as nefarious actions to manipulate the public, quote, or question. Are these strategies and use of data something new in the political world, and how about advertising generally?
Now, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, this is not new in the political world. It's been around for a long time. It feels new to people because it's never gotten into the public press before, at least not in this kind of a volume. So it's understandable that people feel that this has violated a norm, but it's been a norm for a long time.
Okay. I'll reserve my time and go to Senator Feinstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wylie, in February 2018, Special Counsel Mueller indicted 13 Russian nationals and 3 companies for their part in a well-funded, coordinated campaign of information warfare using social media. This information warfare campaign, spearheaded through the Russian-backed Internet Research Agency, started as early as 2014. What can you tell us about possible connections between the SCL group or Cambridge Analytica and Russia?
Thanks for your question. So one of my concerns is the level of engagement that the company had with the company being Cambridge Analytica with Lukoil and executives from Lukoil, which is Russia's second largest oil company. The firm Cambridge Analytica made presentations and sent documents to Lukoil that made reference to its experience in disinformation, that made reference to its experience in rumor campaigns, attitudinal inoculation. Alexander Nix emailed me to say that he passed on a white paper to the CEO of Lukoil. That white paper discussed the data assets that the company had in the United States and the strategies that it was employing. The lead researcher that Cambridge Analytica used to harvest the Facebook data, Dr. Kogan, was also working on projects in Russia on psychological profiling at the University of St. Petersburg. The company had also engaged contractors who had previously worked in Eastern Europe for pro-Russian parties, and indeed the company decided to test Americans' views on the leadership style of Vladimir Putin and Americans' views on Eastern European issues relating to Russian expansionism in the region. To be clear, the only foreign leader that was tested when I was there was Vladimir Putin, and the bulk of the foreign issues that were being tested focused on Russian expansionism in 2014. One of the concerns that I have is that there was a lot of contact with both Russian companies and then also via Dr. Kogan's research, presentations that were being made in Russia that made it known that this research was being done. So what I can't say definitively that this had any relation to the Internet Research Agency, for example, but what I can say is that a lot of noise was being made to companies and individuals who were connected to the Russian government, and for me that is of substantial concern.
Do you think it's possible or even likely that the Facebook data harvested by Cambridge Analytica ended up in Russia?
What I can say is that the lead researcher, Dr. Kogan, who was managing the Facebook harvesting project for Cambridge Analytica, was at the time working on projects that related to psychological profiling in Russia with a Russian team as that was going on. I also know that he was traveling to Russia. I also know, based on conversations that I had with him at the time, that he was making it known to his colleagues in Russia about the project. And so I can't say definitively one way or the other if these data sets did end up in Russia, but what I can say is that it would have been very easy to facilitate that.
You told the UK House of Commons that Cambridge Analytica pitched the Russian oil company Lukoil in its services. You have also said that Alexander Nix gave Lukoil a white paper you wrote that explained Cambridge Analytica's data collection and online targeting of Americans. Lukoil is on the United States sanctions list and is said to be tied to the Russian Federal Security Service, also known as the former KGB. When and where were these meetings taking place?
In London, in the United Kingdom, and also via the phone.
What did Cambridge Analytica tell Lukoil about its data on Americans? Did it share any of that data, or is it possible Russia acquired any of its data on Americans?
In sending the white paper and discussions that I had with Alexander Nix about what he was speaking to the company about, I know that the scale of the data and the location of the data was made known, and also that Dr. Kogan was involved in that data collection project. And the concern that I have is that if you were intending on acquiring the data, even if you were not intending to acquire the data with the willing participation of Cambridge Analytica, what was made known was that this data could have been easily acquired by something as simple as a keylogger on Dr. Kogan's computer when he was visiting Russia.
Thank you. My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Hirsch, I don't really have a question, but if what you're, I'll come back to you if I have time. If what you're saying is that people in America are not persuadable or persuaded by advertising, I think that's rubbish. I think some really smart people spent $200 billion, $206 billion last year on advertising.
You're next.
And I hear kids all the time walk around saying dilly dilly. They didn't just dream that up, okay? But Mr. Wylie, let me ask you a couple questions. I'm not interested in innuendo or speculation or rumor. Other than Facebook, list for me the sources of all of the data that you know Cambridge Analytica used while you worked for it.
There was several different consumer data vendors that were used.
Can you name them, please? I'd like you to be specific.
I believe Experian data was used. I believe Axiom data was used. I'm not sure, but I can get back to you on whether contracts were directly with Axiom and Experian or whether
okay.
it was a reseller.
Who else?
The state voter rolls and registration.
Who else?
There were smaller firms, which I can't give you just off the top of my head, who had more specialized niche data. And then in terms of online data, there were experiments being done on collecting other social media data. So, for example, Twitter, that was also used. But the basis of the modeling that was being done at the time that I was there was primarily using Facebook data.
Okay. Did Cambridge Analytica, put Facebook aside for a second. The Justice Department and the FBI, I'll get to the bottom of that. Did Cambridge Analytica obtain any of this information unlawfully while you were there?
I'm not a lawyer in the United States, so I couldn't comment on whether it was lawful or unlawful.
Well, did they do it improperly? I mean, you've been making normative judgments quite often. Don't
Sure.
get religion now on me.
So the Facebook data, I believe, was
Other than Facebook.
other than Facebook, the consumer data lists that were used were acquired via contracts that were signed and paid for.
Did Cambridge Analytica hack anybody while you were there that you know of?
I have seen documents that make reference to special intelligence services and information gathering networks.
Do you have copies of those documents?
Not with me, no.
Okay. Did Cambridge Analytica get money from WikiLeaks or get information from WikiLeaks?
Not when I was there, no.
Okay. Do you know if they got it after you were there?
In terms of money, I don't
No,
believe.
no, not money. I misspoke. Data. I'm still worked up over dilly dilly.
I wasn't there when the request was made.
While
to
you were there,
journalists.
excuse me for interrupting. I'm not trying to be rude, but we have a limited amount of time.
Sure.
While you were at Cambridge Analytica, give me the names of all its clients, whether it was issue or candidate.
At risk of misspeaking, I am happy to give you a complete list of the clients that were being used at the time.
Okay, who are they?
But after, I know that there were PACs and various candidates that were being.
Like who? I mean, what issues and candidates?
So there was a network of PACs that I believe were primarily financed by Robert Mercer. That were.
Who else?
And then several senatorial and congressional candidates, I believe.
Any issues?
There were issue campaigns. So, for example, John Bolton's PAC was if you consider that an issue-based campaign, then that was an issue-based campaign.
Did Cambridge Analytica work for Russia or anybody connected with Russia while you were there?
We did not have a Russian client at the time that I was there.
Okay. I yield back my 9 seconds.
Who's next?
Thank you, Mr. Wylie.
Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been fascinating, and I'm looking back to the early 2014, under the leadership of Steve Bannon, Cambridge Analytica reportedly began testing slogans like "Build the Wall," "Deep State," "Drain the Swamp." There's also a message testing images and policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now then, later on, of course, we heard "Build the Wall," "Deep State," and "Drain the Swamp" in the Trump campaign, but they were testing these things before there was any Trump campaign. Is that correct?
Yes. So the company was testing, as you said, slogans like "Drain the Swamp," images of walls, paranoia about the deep state in 2014 before the Trump campaign was in existence.
Well, what did they learn from this testing? What did they do with it?
The company learned that there were segments of the population that responded to messages like "Drain the Swamp" or images of walls, or indeed paranoia about the deep state, that weren't necessarily always reflected in mainstream polling or mainstream political discourse that Steve Bannon was interested in using to build his movement.
You've noted that Cambridge Analytica did not actually have any employed staff. It was a front group for the UK-based SEL group. They had Rebecca Mercer, Steve Bannon, among others, on the board of directors. Client work was handled by SEL. Am I correct in all that?
Yes.
Now, our laws prohibit non-Americans from working on U.S. campaigns to protect our elections from foreign interference. A 2014 memo from Cambridge Analytica's outside legal counsel, Rebecca Mercer and Steve Bannon, made these restrictions very clear. Did Cambridge Analytica follow these legal requirements in its work on American campaigns?
Yeah, so I'm the source that provided the media with that memo, which I saw at the tail end of my engagement at Cambridge Analytica. To my understanding, that memo was disregarded because Alexander Nix continued to be the CEO, and they continued to send people to the United States who weren't American citizens. One thing that I would just say is that many of the people who were indeed sent to the United States who weren't American citizens were not privy to that memo and were not made aware that potentially there were violations of U.S. law.
Now, Facebook, of course, has been discussed, has been used in election advertising for some time. If they know somebody lives in a particular state, they can target ads that reflect interests of that state. Not how Cambridge worked. Cambridge Analytica, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, obtained the unauthorized Facebook data of 87 million people, and then targeted them with manipulative disinformation. Is that a correct statement?
That wasn't everything that they did, but yes, that is something that they did do.
How does traditional online marketing compare with how Cambridge Analytica obtained individuals' information and how they used it?
So when you are looking at traditional marketing, first of all, doesn't misappropriate tens of millions of people's data if they're performing their duties legally. And it is not or should not be targeted at people's mental vulnerabilities, such as neuroticism or paranoia, or indeed racial biases. Traditional marketing does not exacerbate people's innate prejudices, and coerce them and make them believe things that aren't necessarily true.
But you also say that they were a full-service propaganda machine that discouraged voters who are more prone to voting for Democratic or liberal candidates. And some of their U.S. clients prevailed extremely close races. Why did Cambridge Analytica's American clients, investors like the Mercer family, invested $20 million? Believe these tactics might be helpful.
So Steve Bannon is a follower of something called the Breitbart Doctrine, which posits that politics is downstream from culture. So if you want to have any lasting or enduring changes in politics, you have to focus on the culture. And when Steve Bannon uses the term culture war, he uses that term pointedly, and they were seeking out companies that could build an arsenal of informational weapons to fight that war, which is why they went to a British military contractor which specialized in information operations.
Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'll have questions I submit for the record, especially the Israeli and Russian state security services.
Yeah, let me announce to everybody that record stays open for a week. And then if you folks get written questions from people that are here, like Senator Leahy, or people that don't come, we'd appreciate if you'd answer them and get them back to us as soon as you can. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wylie, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. Mr. Wylie, while you fault Cambridge Analytica for using its data that it obtained, you say, without authorization in its voter targeting efforts, at the same time, you took that same data with you upon leaving the company. Isn't that right?
So, because there were no staff at Cambridge Analytica, most people were contractors or indeed had companies. So I received a copy of the data.
Okay,
yes.
so you had that data and then you started your own company.
No, my company was in existence before I left Cambridge Analytica.
Okay, okay.
Because I was a contractor.
But after leaving the company, you had a meeting, or perhaps a series of meetings, with a major campaign to discuss some micro-targeting techniques. In short,
that's not true. I didn't meet another campaign to discuss that. If you're in reference to that data set.
Well, it appears that you tried to use some of the same market as your former company. You were going to use that data for something, right? You weren't just going to leave it idle.
Well, to be clear, the data was never used on any commercial.
So why did you take it with you?
It's not that I took the data with me. It's just that it was still in existence at the time that I left.
Okay.
To be clear, I didn't take any data from Cambridge Analytica.
You didn't take it in the sense that it was already with you?
Yes.
Okay. What type of work did you anticipate that your company would perform after you left Cambridge Analytica?
So I work mostly in data analytics, looking at different kinds of social trends. So after I left Cambridge Analytica, I continued working on independent projects. But to be clear, I didn't use that data on any commercial contract.
But couldn't that data have proven useful in some of your work?
It could have, but I didn't go on and sell it.
Right, but you could have, and had you been successful with that, and had you gone on and your business become successful, couldn't you have now been at the receiving end of some of the same questions now going to Cambridge Analytica?
Yes, but it didn't happen.
Understood. I want to go over some statements that you've made. In paragraph 15 of your testimony, you say, and I quote, "When I was at SCL and CA, I was made aware of the firm's black ops capacity, which I understood to include using hackers to break into computer systems to acquire compromat or other intelligence for its clients. The firm referred to these operations as special intelligence services or special IT services." How did you learn about these black ops capacities?
Alexander Nix told me.
And who, as a practical matter, was involved in these black ops?
My understanding was that in some of the projects that SCL Group had in different parts of the world, misappropriated information was used as compromat in elections, in particular against opposition candidates.
Okay. In paragraph 30, you say, quote, the Russian project undertaken by Dr. Corgan had a particular focus on the dark triad traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The Russian project also conducted behavior research on online trolling. How do you learn all of this? And can you describe those projects in more detail?
So at the time, Dr. Kogan told me about some of the research that he was doing. He also told the company about some of the research that was being done by that team in Russia. So there's email correspondence from the firm that, for example, referenced the, quote, work that he was doing for the Russians. So it was initially through conversations that I had with Dr. Kogan, and then later through the investigative reporting that has been done for the past year with The Guardian and others. More details have emerged as well.
Okay. Professor Hirsch, the use of social media to micro-target is a fairly new practice, but it's my understanding that micro-targeting itself is not. And sadly, the use of provocative information to either divide the electorate or to mobilize portions of the electorate has a long history in our country's political campaigns. So is the use of social media to micro-target different than what it's been done, how it's been done in the past?
So there's a lot we don't know. We don't know about its effectiveness in some ways, but it often looks the same. And also responding to Senator Kennedy, just because campaigns spend a lot of money on a particular ad kind doesn't mean it works. For a long time, campaigns are spending money on robocalls. Countless experiments have shown that robocalls do nothing. In an environment where there's lots of stimuli, a lot going on in a campaign, a lot of campaign ads don't really work. Probably nobody in this room, or nobody that anyone in this room knows, changed their mind as a result of any campaign ad in the 2016 election. Now, for someone who's a director of research for Cambridge Analytica, they should know, it'd be shocking if they didn't know, the actual effect, an estimate of which campaign ads do what. Part of my skepticism comes because given that there's been whistleblowing, there's been no presentation of any such evidence in randomized controlled environments in which someone shows, here is the effect. This ad targeting neuroticism or whatever had some effect. So again, it's very hard to sort this out as technology changes from 2000, 2004, 8, 12, 16. Lots of things are new. But one point we often come back to is that in a presidential election, particularly when there's so much going on, the effect of one ad or one kind of ad or one robocall is usually zero.
Okay.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Wylie. You've said that Cambridge Analytica and the SCL Group are effectively the same thing, and that Cambridge Analytica was the front-facing company for SCL's American operations. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is SCL Elections?
So there is a group company in the UK, or was, called SCL Group, which had several different divisions. The largest division when I first joined was Defense, so SCL Defense. SCL Elections was one of the other divisions, SCL Commercial, et cetera, and they all handled different markets for the company. So SCL Elections handled political. What
are SCL Canada and Aggregate IQ?
Those were subcontractors that were set up during the time that I was there to build out software infrastructure. They played a very significant role in building the actual infrastructure of Ripon, the software product Ripon.
Are they essentially the same entity, SCL Canada and Aggregate IQ?
You could think of them like a franchise.
And the Ripon program was the program that developed the software to use the Facebook data.
Yes. Once you have algorithms and a set of targets, you need something to then actually connect those targets with an online display network. So that's part of the role that Ripon played.
What is Global Science Research?
Global Science Research was the company that was set up by Dr. Kogan.
And you've said that it became a company simply to service Cambridge Analytica, correct?
It became a company, as I understand it, it became a company so that it could sign a contract with Cambridge Analytica, or rather, technically SCL.
Is it fair to describe the entities that I have all just described as a coordinated network?
Yes.
And what was the role of Robert Mercer in funding that coordinated network?
He was the primary funder who put in tens of millions of US dollars into Cambridge Analytica, which then distributed that money to that network.
Did that Cambridge Analytica network, including SCL, have a recurring contracting relationship with Black Cube?
When I was there, we did not have a contract with Black Cube.
Have you since become aware of a connection between SCL Group and Black Cube and working together on projects?
I've become aware of relationships that the company had with former members of Israeli security services.
How about ASI Data Science? You've said that that company's CTO worked on SCL projects, that it was a subcontractor to Cambridge Analytica, and that there was a revolving cast of data scientists between that organization and Cambridge Analytica.
Yes.
They're a frequent contractor?
When I was there, I believe their role was as a supplier of, as the company was growing, there was an increased demand for more and more data scientists, and they were, I believe the contract that they had was to provide data scientists as the company grew.
Consider them a part of the Cambridge Analytica network we described?
If your definition of network is anybody who has an ongoing relationship, then sure.
You said that the company Palantir had staff that were working on the data at Cambridge Analytica, that there were meetings with Palantir at Palantir offices, and that Palantir staff helped build the models for the Ripon program. Is that all correct?
Yes, although to clarify, Palantir said that all of the work that was being done by Palantir staff was done in a personal capacity.
So let's just take, I've got a minute left, let's just take a quick look at Brexit. Some of the forces behind Brexit were Vote Leave, Be Leave, and Veterans for Britain, correct?
Yes.
All of them had contracts with Aggregate IQ?
Yes.
Is there anything peculiar about their contracts with Aggregate IQ?
It's highly suggestive of coordination and data sharing, but that is currently being investigated by the Electoral Commission in the UK.
Because Aggregate IQ would have been really hard to find at the time. It didn't even have a website, correct?
It didn't have a website, no.
And do we know that Vote Leave actually funneled money into Be Leave and into Veterans for Britain that then went to fund Aggregate IQ contracts?
Yes, we do.
Do we also have connections between Leave.eu and UKIP and Eldon Insurance?
Yes.
Related to AIQ's Brexit efforts?
Not to AIQ's Brexit efforts, but rather that side of the Leave campaign engaged with Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge Analytica directly. Okay, well, my time has expired. I will, if there's a second round, I'd love to have one.
Senator Cornyn, and then it'll be Senator Klobuchar. I'm going to step out for a few minutes, so at the end of his 5 minutes, you take over.
Mr. Wylie, let me start with you, please. The sort of data mining that you've been describing and the targeting of messages has multiple applications, correct? It could be a commercial application. For example, when I buy something on Amazon or a movie on Netflix, they can send me information about something else I might like. It can be used to persuade people in a political campaign for or against a candidate or for or against a particular issue. And it also can be used for covert information operations by governments, correct?
All of that is correct, yes. Data is like any kind of tool. You can use it for various means, some very beneficial and legal and others not.
Right. So did SCL or Cambridge Analytica serve all comers? In other words, were you open for business to whoever wanted to purchase the services, or did they?
That was the impression that I got. Alexander Nix was quite keen on selling contracts. However, after Robert Mercer put his investment into Cambridge Analytica, I do know that we weren't, the only restriction that we had was to not work with Democrats.
Okay, okay. Well, like, for example, Fusion GPS is much in the news, and they provided opposition research to the DNC in the against the Trump campaign. The data itself and the means by which you analyze it and use it is pretty much agnostic, correct? In other words, you can use it for or against a political candidate, a product, or for an information campaign, like we said.
Yes.
Okay. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, when he was here the other day, he kept saying, we don't sell data. And I responded to him, well, you clearly rent it. I don't know whether that's a fair characterization or not. How would you characterize the social media platforms like Facebook use of personal data? They say they don't sell it. How would you characterize it?
They've created a platform that encourages the use of data. So it's true that you can't go to Facebook and simply buy Facebook's data, but they make it readily available to its customers via its network of applications, or the fact that the layouts of people's profiles on Facebook makes it very conducive to scraping data, for example. Although Facebook would say that they don't allow that, they still create a setup which catalyzes its misuse, in my view.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg also said that the terms of service that consumers agree to when they sign on to Facebook, he said people probably don't read it, or if they read it, they don't really understand it. Is your impression that most of the public has no idea about what they are sharing with these companies?
When you even talk to lawyers who read through the terms and conditions, some of it's even dense for a lawyer. So I think that it's unreasonable to expect a regular, ordinary person to have the burden of understanding dense legal text. And the other thing that I would say is that, you know, social media is not really a choice for most people. The internet is not really a choice for most people. It is very difficult to be a functioning member of the workforce or society and refuse to use the internet. I don't know a job that would let you go in and refuse to use Google, for example. I don't know, you know, most hiring requires a LinkedIn profile now. So although we use this narrative of choice because someone's pushing a button, even if they had read the terms and conditions and understood it, they substantively don't really have a choice, because in the modern workforce, you have to use social media and you have to use the internet.
They don't really have other options. So.
I don't know a job that would hire somebody who refuses to use the internet.
So do you think it's too much to expect that these social media platforms get consumers informed consent? I mean, there is this idea in the law, for example, if you're going to consent to a surgical procedure by your doctor, that that your consent must be informed. In other words, you have to understand what you're agreeing to. Do you think that's too much to ask for in this context?
It's not that it's too much. It's not too much to ask for. People absolutely should have informed consent, but the analogy is not equivalent. When you go and see a doctor and you need a surgery, you need something, and that you consenting to that surgery is proportionate to the benefit that you're getting. When somebody consents, quote unquote, to something online, even if they understand that they're consenting to their data being harvested, if that's the only way that you can get a job, it's not really genuinely a fair situation. And so the point that I would make to you is that we should take a step back from this narrative of consent and start to look at the fact that people don't have a choice. They have to use a lot of these platforms to be functional in society and the workforce.
Well, I don't have to use Facebook. I can use Twitter. I can use.
But all of these platforms do the same thing. Right? They all, as soon as you sign up to Twitter, as soon as you sign up to Google, as soon as you sign up to anything, they all will be collecting a hugely disproportionate amount of data compared to the utility that they provide to you. And further, the other thing that I would say is that when you're looking at technology, you know, there's a question of not just informed consent in the present, but reasonable expectations in the future. When I first signed up to Facebook, it didn't have facial recognition. I posted all of my photos, and then Facebook developed facial recognition algorithms that then can go and search the internet and find other things that I'm doing, right? So it's not a question of just informed consent. It's about, is it proportionate to the benefit that the consumer is getting, is it reasonably expected in the future, if there's future developments in that technology, that the consumer did actually consent to that at the time? And more broadly, this narrative of consent is slightly problematic in the sense that when people have to use these platforms, it doesn't matter whether or not they understand. If they have to use it to get a job, they will still use it. And so we are sort of coercing and compelling people to hand over a lot of information, which not only now could be dangerous, but you have to imagine in the future also what the developments of technology, what developments we'll see moving forward, and what kinds of risks we'll be exposing to people 10 years from now when that data about them still exists.
Well, my time is up. I would just conclude by saying that companies now can and do market their services and products based upon people's expectations of privacy. And so if consumers are fully informed about what they're doing, what the consequences are, they can make their choices. It may create markets for other alternative platforms where people's data will be more protected.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your succinct answers, Mr. Wylie, and they're to the point. Last month, Senator Kennedy and I introduced a bill to protect consumers' privacy online, and included in that bill is giving consumers the right to control their own data by allowing people to opt out of having their data collected and requiring companies to notify consumers of a privacy violation within 72 hours. You've previously expressed support for allowing users to opt out of all targeting criteria in 3 clicks or less, as well as rules to require the data collected by each app be proportional to the app's actual purpose. Would Cambridge Analytica have been able to harvest the data of Facebook users and their friends if the users had opted out of having their data tracked by Facebook?
It would. Well, the problem was that Facebook had set up applications that physically allowed the collection of friends' data. So one of the other things that I would say is that in addition to giving consumers rights, we should be putting obligations on companies themselves. So a principle of privacy by design, which treats privacy as an engineering problem, as a safety problem, would also be incredibly beneficial because privacy is not just a governance issue or a terms issue or a policy issue. It's a physical engineering issue when it comes to software.
And do you think that they would just do that on their own, or do you think it would be good to have some? Thank you. That is my response to one of my friends on the other side of the aisle, and why Senator Kennedy and I have proposed this bill. Secondly, the Honest Ads Act, a bill that I've done with Senator McCain and Senator Warner. I understand you've supported the idea that there should be more transparency of political ads.
Absolutely.
You know there's no requirements in place. In your written testimony, you stated if a foreign actor dropped propaganda leaflets by airplane over Florida or Michigan, that would universally be condemned as a hostile act, but this is happening online. As you know, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft are now supporting my bill, and they are taking measures to disclose these ads, especially Facebook. Do you think that this patchwork of voluntary measures, though, will be the answer?
No, I think that just in the same way that we require safety standards and everything else that we care about, we should be requiring safety standards and transparency standards in software and online platforms.
Thank you. At last month's hearing, I asked Mr. Zuckerberg if Facebook had determined whether the up to 87 million Facebook users whose data was shared with Cambridge Analytica were concentrated in certain states. Mr. Zuckerberg said that he would follow up with a state-by-state breakdown of those users. I want to ask if you have any knowledge as to whether those Facebook users were mostly in any particular states.
I can't say off the top of my head what the density was in each state, but I do know that there were particular focus. There was a particular focus on states from the company's activities on swing states and states that were winnable by Republicans.
States like Wisconsin, Michigan.
Yes.
Pennsylvania. We again await that information from Facebook. Mr. Wylie, I also asked Mr. Zuckerberg whether any of the roughly 126 million people who may have been shown content from a Facebook page associated with the Russian troll farm, the Internet Research Agency, were the same users whose data was shared with Cambridge Analytica. He replied that he believes it is, quote, entirely possible that there will be a connection there. what can you say about the potential for any overlap between the Facebook users whose data Cambridge Analytica obtained and the users who were shown content from the Internet Research Agency?
The thing that I would say is, so firstly, I didn't ever deal with the Internet Research Agency, so I can't comment specifically on that entity. But to your point, my concern is that information either may have been shared or indeed misappropriated, again, at the second instance, by a Russian entity from Cambridge Analytica. What I would say, though, is that it's not just whether or not these individual records were then targeted, because if they were used to build an algorithm, whether that algorithm was built at Cambridge Analytica or another entity, other users who share similar profiles and patterns in their data could have also been exposed in a way that if you simply looked at were these records targeted specifically, even if the answer is no, that doesn't mean that those records weren't used to build a targeting algorithm.
I get it. Well, I'll follow up on the second round here. One last question, as you use the word profiling and this voter disengagement, as you called it, voter suppression. One of the most horrifying things from our hearings that I saw were these ads that were clearly made to suppress the votes of African Americans. Do you have any knowledge about the scope of this activity and how often it occurred out of the company?
My knowledge relates to the tail end of my engagement with Cambridge Analytica. One of the things that did provoke me to leave was the beginnings of discussions about voter disengagement. I have seen documents that reference voter disengagement, and I recall conversations that that it was intended to focus on African American voters.
And can we get those documents?
I will discuss with my lawyers the best way to get you that information.
Okay, and just to be clear, just as you said it would be illegal, an act of illegal act to have an airplane come in with those pamphlets, this under American law where you are specifically suppressing votes is also an illegal act. So. Thank you.
And to be clear, I didn't partake myself.
No. I understand, and that's why you left in part. So I get that, and I appreciate you coming to testify very much today. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, the chair has asked me to chair the committee, and I also happen to be in the next order for. I'm not taking chair's prerogative. It's my turn. So thank you all for being here. I think this is a very helpful hearing. I intend to be here for the second round as well. And Mr. Wylie, I just leaned over to the ranking member and said that she was complimenting you on your technical expertise. And I said, I love having a witness before the stand that I can actually understand. I can't necessarily understand lawyers, but I can understand data analytics people because I was one. I hope that the result of this hearing is actually trying to figure out what, if anything, Congress should do from a regulatory framework and compliance framework with respect to the new avenue for data use. You know, all of us in these committees have already used data from aggregators. We take the voter data. We know what voting propensities are. It's downloaded from the boards of election. You use that as a basis for targeting voters. And then there was the next wave, data aggregators, so that you can overlay people's affiliations with associations, the magazine subscriptions. That's all really become passé in terms of data matching. It's been happening for probably 10 or 20 years in our campaigns, and I would dare say that every single member here who's ran up for election has had that. Now that is where they buy data and they aggregate it, and then they build their proprietary platforms around it. Now with the advent of social media, we have entities who have come into play that really don't want to sell their data. They want to sell the analytic result of that data so that they can target people on certain social media platforms. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, it's the age of access rather than the age of transfer in terms of data. And something just
because would you believe that that data, that baseline, is a part of their intellectual capital, a part of their institutional value?
Yes, data is an incredibly powerful. It's like the new oil.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd be happy for either of the other two witnesses to chime in. A part of when Mr. Zuckerberg was before us just some weeks back, I tried to focus on what we should all be looking at as policymakers, as other practices beyond the Cambridge Analytica. And I should say that my firm engaged Cambridge Analytica. I met them the day that they proposed it, and I saw them again on election day. I do have some questions about the focus on trying to get cyclographic data from people through in-person interviews. It may or may not have been captured through some of the techniques that we're discussing today. But I also want to go back and talk about, if we're going to do a thorough, impartial, nonpartisan review of the facts, that we really should go back probably over about the last 10 years. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to, but I would commend it to you to read in the MIT Technology Review. They had a 3-part series, and the series was titled How Obama's Team Used Big Data to Rally Voters. And if you go through that very well-written review, and through articles associated with it, there were quotes from campaign workers who said, we literally took the whole social graph from Facebook and were able to download it through the use of an application. There's a term in here, I don't know the specific page, but they talk about gamifying the apps that campaign workers would use, and possibly gamifying the apps that would-be supporters would use. And in the Obama campaign, I think it may have been the first one, could have been the second, they actually asked whether or not, if you were a Facebook user, if you would mind, by clicking on a button, be willing to share information about all your friends. In my case, I have about 4,900 friends. So by clicking that button, I was actually giving access to thousands of people's information without their knowledge. And this was a documented practice that I think also has to be looked at in the context of creating good policy that's based on various uses, contemporary uses of data on social media platforms. And so in my remaining time in this, in the first round, I would just ask you, do you believe that some of the technology players today simply have grown so large, so quickly, that some of what you thought would have been captured through just good corporate governance and code of conduct, having somebody from a social media platform who either leans conservative or leans liberal, kind of putting their thumb on the scale and giving them people information that they really shouldn't if they were good stewards of the data and the social media platform that they were on? And I'll leave that as an open question to anybody on the panel and reserve my remainder for the next round.
I just say that, you know, I don't hold the view that Facebook is somehow necessary for our lives. As an instructor of political science, I encourage my students never to share information about politics or ads or news online because they're not professional editors. They should direct their attention to news sources that have editors. The idea that you must contact your friends and family and upload pictures and that there is no alternative is really something that doesn't strike me, not as an expert, but as an ordinary citizen, as something that's true. And so I think in answering your question, Facebook has a lot of data. I think it's acted really inappropriately in terms of how it's conveyed news, sold ads to just about anyone who wants to. Target hate groups, fine. Bring it in. We have an algorithm. We don't pay too much attention to it, and it's not our fault if it goes wrong. I think it's a really terrible way that they've conducted business. And again, I wouldn't encourage people to use Facebook, but I am surprised by people's continuing interest in the company.
I'd concur a lot in what he was saying. I think it's difficult to argue that Facebook per se is necessary for people's lives when about half the internet users aren't on it, and there are lots of other types of social media. To your point about would someone with a particular ideological political view tilt the scales one way or another. I don't know if people would deliberately do it. They might, but by the nature they will, because what I view as true is influenced by how I think ideologically. And so things that I might screen out and say, well, this is bad, this is disruptive to the community, would be influenced by how I think.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Tillis, and thank you to the panel for the chance to be with you today. I think the reason this matters is that we're talking about the intersection of several important developments that are difficult for the average American to understand. Big data and social media and foreign interference in our 2016 election and we're trying to tease out what actually happened or didn't happen. Mr. Wylie, let me start with you. Cambridge University professor Michael Kaczynski studied the use of Facebook data and found that based on average of 68 Facebook likes by a user, these are just likes, what you liked or disliked, you could predict sexual orientation, political party affiliation, race with 85% accuracy. Further factors like religious affiliation, alcohol or drug use, even whether your parents were divorced, could be deduced. Is that your understanding of that analysis? And do you think Cambridge Analytica and the work of Professor Kogan used that predictive power to develop algorithms that then weaponized differences between Americans for electoral gain?
So the basis of the research that we were doing at Cambridge Analytica was from the papers that you're citing from Dr. Kaczynski. So the firm replicated his approach and then sought to improve it.
And did I correctly summarize the incredibly high correlation that you could show in terms of really knowing the individual Facebook user if you had access to their likes and their friends and their social media activity?
Yeah, it increases the particular paper that you're citing. The number of likes, once you surpass 100 and 200, you can get to the same level of accuracy at predicting, for example, personality traits as your spouse would if they were answering questions about you, and in comparison to how you would respond to those same questions.
So to a core point that Professor Hirsch made earlier, all of us who have stood for election have struggled with the difficulty of actually targeting our voters effectively, because the data sets we've had access to, mostly publicly available data, are very thin, very narrow. There's very little that we have. The data sets that Facebook has access to, that's why it's a multi-billion-dollar company, are unbelievably deep and rich. And so it's unlike anything we've had to confront before, correct?
Yeah, I don't contest what Professor Hirsch was saying in the sense that there are, it is true, persuading somebody compared to motivating them to turn out is much more difficult. And the data sets that traditionally were used are often very sparse and not necessarily reliable. But that's
data sets that are available now through Facebook are orders of magnitude.
Yes, and that's why Cambridge Analytica ended up pursuing that path, because it found that in comparison to traditional marketing data sets, the data that you could procure from social networking sites was much more dense and actually much more reliable to create a precise algorithm.
And to be clear, a billionaire American megadonor and supporter of the Trump campaign funded a shell corporation, Cambridge Analytica, still run by foreign nationals, to take advantage of this research, this understanding, and gained access to 87 million Americans' Facebook information and developed some of the algorithms that came out of that. I want to ask you, in the time I have remaining, about your experience working with Steve Bannon, one of President Trump's senior campaign advisors, and the goals that he used Cambridge Analytica to achieve. Was one of his goals to suppress voting or discourage certain individuals in the United States from voting?
That was my understanding, yes.
Was voter suppression a service that U.S. clients could request in their contracts with Cambridge Analytica while Bannon was vice president?
Yes.
And so Steve Bannon is running an organization where you could, as a client, request in contracts voter suppression using this remarkable data set.
I don't know if it was referenced in contracts, but I have seen documents that make reference to it in relation to client requests and services provided.
Let me ask a last question. You testified that back in 2014, Cambridge Analytica set up focus groups, message testing, and polling on Americans' views on the leadership of Vladimir Putin and Russia's expansionism in Eastern Europe. You've also testified that it's entirely possible, would have been relatively easy, for Russian intelligence to put a keylogger on Professor Kogan's computer and get access to this full data set. Why do you think Cambridge Analytica was testing Putin's aggressive actions? And what threat would it pose to our 2018 elections if this entire data set, all the algorithms that go with it, are currently in the hands of Russian intelligence?
So I don't have a clear answer as to why the company was so engaged in testing Russian expansionism in the leadership of Vladimir Putin. That's a question better put to Steve Bannon. In terms of the dangers for not just American democracy, but other democracies around the world, this data is powerful, and if it's put into the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. And we have to understand that companies like Facebook and platforms like Facebook or Twitter are not just social networking sites. They're opportunities for information warfare, not just by state actors, but also non-state actors. And so we really do have to look at protecting cyberspace as a national security issue, just in the same way that we have agencies to protect our borders, land, sea, and air.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wylie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Thank you for being here. I think Americans are rightly concerned about privacy and the security of our data. And we're also concerned about the power that is being collected in Silicon Valley of a handful of companies having enormous troves of data that they're able to use and employ with very few rules governing what they do with that information. Much of the media attention in recent weeks and months has focused on the data operation of the Trump campaign. But the Trump campaign was hardly the first to employ data in a very significant way in a political campaign. Dr. Jameson, in your written testimony, you talked about the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012 and their data operations. Can you share with this committee what the Obama campaign did regarding data in 08 and 12?
Sure. During the 2008 campaign, what they did is they had as an advisor a co-founder of Facebook who helped them understand how they could use Facebook and obtain data from Facebook. And a lot of that work was done by consultants, but that was the center of it. In 2012, the campaign changed its strategy and then pulled all of that in-house and made it much, much more effective. They were able to combine their Facebook data more cleverly, more carefully with other sources of data and do a much better job of understanding what individual voters were like, who was connecting with whom, and how they could understand those conversations.
And has Facebook approached access to data on a fair and even-handed manner? Allowing candidates from whichever party the same access to data, or have they been more political and partisan players in that regard?
I have no knowledge of that.
I will note that Carol Davidson, who was the Director of Data Integration and Media Analytics for the Obama for America 2012, she said, quote, "Facebook was surprised that we were able to suck out the whole social graph, but they didn't stop us once they realized that was what we were doing." And she also said that Facebook, quote, "came to office in the days following election recruiting, and they were very candid that they allowed us to do things that they wouldn't have allowed someone else to do because they were on our side." So that's the head of data analytics for the Obama campaign saying Facebook is giving preferential treatment to the Obama campaign because that's the political side they're on. Did they give the Romney campaign the same access to data in that election in 2012?
Not to my knowledge.
All right, how about in 2016? There's been a lot of discussion of what the Trump campaign did with data. Did the Hillary Clinton campaign have a data operation?
I presume so, but I'm not familiar with what. There was not very much written about her campaign on any of this.
So does anyone on the panel know what the Hillary Clinton campaign did on the data side? Does anyone on the panel think that there is a chance in a million years that the Hillary Clinton campaign didn't have a substantial investment in data analytics? Mr. Wylie, sure.
So campaigns across the spectrum in the United States use data, and just to your point, when we look at a lot of people are concerned about, for example, the ability of big government to inhibit our liberties and choice. Mm-hmm. Big data can engineer a situation that limits our choice and our freedom, and it's not a partisan issue. So to your point about other parties using types of access on Facebook, I actually agree with you in the sense that there is a substantial risk of distorting the electoral process if a company like Facebook decides to pick a side, whether that is Democrat or Republican. Right. And so the thing that I would hope that this committee and others really internalize is that we're talking about Cambridge Analytica, but it's not a partisan issue. We're talking about the future of how these technology companies operate and the risks to ordinary American citizens and the risks to the integrity of our democratic processes here in the United States and around the world. And that's not a partisan issue.
Well, I very much agree with that, and I would note that there is an overlay on top of that, that Facebook and other social media companies are now the vehicle through which some 70% of Americans get their political news. And so the specter of censorship, I think, is a profound threat to liberty. And so I appreciate this panel being here, and thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. Mr. Wylie, are you aware of conversations between Cambridge Analytica executives and any representatives of the Russian government or people associated with the Russian government?
I'm aware of meetings that the company had with Lukoil, which has close connections with the Russian government.
Are those conversations documented anywhere in any letters or emails or any other kinds of evidence?
There are documents pertaining to the conversations and presentations made to Lukoil, and I have passed on some of those documents to the authorities.
To this committee?
Not yet to this committee, no.
Would you be willing to provide them to this committee?
I will consult my lawyers as to the best way to get you that information.
Thank you. During your time at Cambridge Analytica, my understanding is that you are aware of the founders or funders, including Robert Mercer, providing monies so that they would not be, quote, necessarily considered declarable campaign contributions. Are you aware of conversations to that effect by Mr. Mercer or anyone else?
What I'm referencing is what was explained to me after I inquired as to the relatively convoluted setup that was happening in the United States with respect to the setup of Cambridge Analytica. What was explained to me is there was and this isn't necessarily to say that this was the primary reason, so it could be an ancillary benefit, but that when you invest money as an investor into a company that you own, it doesn't necessarily constitute an electoral contribution which is declarable.
So let me just cut right to the intent of my question. Was there a specific explanation to you that the purpose of structuring these funds as investments was to, in effect, avoid the reporting requirements or other provisions of United States election laws?
It was explained to me as a benefit of the setup.
Were there any firewalls during the time you worked at Cambridge Analytica that separated work on different campaigns, or were the funds, in effect, commingled in all the campaigns?
Whilst I was there, I did not see firewalls being set up or any sort of barriers between people or conversations, if that's your question.
So there was no recognition of the legal responsibility to separate campaigns?
I'm aware of memos from the company's lawyers to some of the executives of the company that outline the responsibilities in the United States to separate contact between staff and activities that relate to different campaigns or PACs, et cetera. But
those memos were instructions.
those memos were instructions from,
But-
or rather advice from lawyers to executives. But when I was there, I did not see.
In practice, those instructions were not followed.
No.
Can you provide some specific examples of your direct knowledge of either focus groups or other efforts to suppress voting?
So in terms of specifics, I'm happy to work with the committee to give a more full explanation. Just, I understand there's limits on time, but I am aware of research that was being looked at about what motivates and indeed what demotivates different types of people. And so if you focus on messaging that demotivates certain types of people, you decrease the amount of turnout.
Thank you. Dr. Jameson, you served as part of the agency landing team in the transition for the Federal Communications Commission for President-elect Trump, correct?
Yes.
During that time, did you have any contact with Michael Cohn about FCC policy?
No.
During the transition? Did you ever meet him?
No, not to my knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. So we're here today to talk about how Cambridge Analytica obtained sensitive data about millions of Americans from Facebook without users' knowledge or consent, and then used that data to target voters and influence our elections. And there are broader issues of privacy that are highlighted by this incident, and I think it's worth stepping back to pull all this in context for the American public. To put it plainly, most Americans have entered into a bargain with Facebook and other web service providers in which users unknowingly give those companies huge amounts of personal data in exchange for the free service of social networking. In turn, Facebook uses this data to show its users carefully targeted ads, which are the source of 98% of Facebook's revenue. Interestingly enough, this business model makes the Facebook user the product and makes the advertisers the customer. But let's be clear. This arrangement is not always working in the best interests of the American people. First, users have little to no idea just how Facebook collects their data, including tracking the user's location, the device they are using, their IP address, and activities on other websites. To be clear, this occurs whether or not they are logged into Facebook and whether or not they even use Facebook. Let me put this in perspective. In the real world, this would be like someone following you every single day as you walk down the street, watching what you do, where you go, for how long, and with whom you're with. For most people, it would feel like an invasion of privacy, and they'd call the cops. And yes, social network sites technically lay all this out in their terms of service. But let's be honest, few Americans can decipher or understand what this contract means. Second, as this hearing illustrates, Americans do not have real control over the data collected on them, and there's almost nothing that users can do once data is shared with third parties. I believe it is therefore government's responsibility to help create rules that yield a better and more fair bargain for the American people, one that respects their rights as consumers and their privacy. In the meantime, I have a few questions I have for the witnesses today. Mr. Wylie, in particular, you've mentioned there's been a lot of discussion about how Cambridge Analytica targeted African American voters and discouraged them from participating in elections when Steve Bannon was the vice president. What specifically did Steve Bannon or anyone else decide motivates or demotivates African Americans to vote?
So it's not just focusing on racial characteristics of people. Actually, when you poll a random sample of African Americans, they're not all the same people. Oftentimes they're very different, have very different lives and different motivators. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at any program, whether it is motivating or demotivating someone, understanding their internal characteristics is a very powerful thing, because you don't treat them just as a black person, you treat them as who they are. That can be used to encourage people to vote or discourage people to vote.
So how specifically then did they target African American voters? Understanding as you do that the African American population is not a monolith. How did they then decipher and determine who was African American so they would target them in their intent to suppress the vote?
So racial characteristics can be modeled, and I'm not sure about the studies that my colleague here was referencing, but we were able to get an AUC score, which is a way of measuring accuracy for race that was 0.89, I believe.
Can you tell me AUC is what?
Area under the receiving operations characteristic. It's a way of measuring precision, which means it's very high. Okay. But to be clear, I didn't participate on any voter suppression programs. So I can't comment on the specifics of those programs. I can comment on their existence, and I can comment more generally on my understanding of what they were doing. But those questions are better placed for Steve Bannon.
Okay, and I join in the request for any documents you can share with us that are evidence of the conduct you've described. On a different note, what should Facebook have done to verify that either you or Cambridge Analytica, in fact, had deleted the unauthorized data?
So I can't speak for Cambridge Analytica. I can speak for myself.
Please.
In 2016, they sent me a letter that said, we're aware that you may still have data from this harvesting program. It informed me that Dr. Kogan actually didn't have permission to use the application that he was using for commercial purposes and only academic purposes. That was actually new information to me. I did not know that at the time. And then it requested that if I still had the data, to delete it, and then sign a certification of that that I no longer have the data.
Did it require you to sign that under the supervision of a notary, or just sign it and send it back?
It did not require a notary or any sort of legal procedure. So I signed the certification and sent it back, and they accepted it.
Senator Harris, if you want, just as a housekeeping, we will have a vote called around noon.
Sure, I have nothing else.
On
Thank
Senate
you.
time, we know that means we need to be there within about 25 minutes. So I think we'll be able to get the first round. We have Senators Durbin, Hirono, and Booker, and I'm happy to stick around to the end of the vote for anyone if we can agree to 3-minute rounds in the remaining time before the vote's called. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses. Let me say initially, Senator Harris, I thought your presentation on the issue of privacy was spot on. It really described what we are about, at least one of the things we should be about. I asked a question of Mr. Zuckerberg, whether he felt comfortable telling me the name of the hotel he stayed in last night. And after a couple minutes or seconds of hesitation, he said no. I've asked a lot of questions in the Senate. That one got a lot of attention, I think because it really got to the heart of the issue in terms of Mr. Zuckerberg and his own feeling about personal privacy and where he would draw the line. We know, of course, from what Senator Harris has said and what we all know from life experience is the last hotel I stayed in is probably a matter of some record with my name attached to it somewhere, who knows. But privacy is a critical issue here, and the right of Facebook or any entity to use my information without my express permission, I think, is over the line. I said to Senator Cornyn, my friend, I meant it earlier when he said that he thought consumers were aware when information was being gathered on him, that I'm sure he's wrong. We have now put a little piece of electric tape over the camera on my laptop.
Good.
Most people do now because they're being watched and they may not even know it. But there are two other issues here that I'd like to spend a moment addressing. And one of them relates to Mr. Nix. Mr. Nix is a British national, is that correct?
Yes.
And he was clearly involved in some of the campaign activities of Cambridge Analytica.
He was the CEO of the company, so he was the point person for all of the clients. and he often made the presentations and recommendations to those clients.
And the Federal Election Commission says expressly that regulations prohibit foreign nationals from directing, dictating, controlling, or directly or indirectly participating in the decision-making process of any person with regard to any election-related activities in the United States. So there is a red flag or red Union Jack, whatever you want to call it, that should make it clear that we're in a territory here that it may be a violation of law. You have said that the involvement of Cambridge and successor organizations and Russia came after you left. Is that correct?
No. Sorry, can you clarify slightly what you mean by my experience is direct as it relates to Lukoil, as it relates to understanding, the research that was being done in terms of the focus groups and all of that.
But in the use of information by the Russians in the election campaign.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yes.
That was either happened some other place or after you had left Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, I was not aware at the time that there was activities in Russia to influence the United States elections.
So I would just add that to the second category. The first question, privacy. The second question is the involvement of foreign nationals in the United States campaign, whether Mr. Nix personally or Russia as a country trying to influence the impact. The third has been brought up by my colleagues and I think gets to the heart of another very important issue, and that is the issue of the secrecy of this activity. The fact that we know that Mr. Mercer was engaged in this is because of something called open secrets and other sources that weren't disclosed in the ordinary course of business in this. And did you have any guidance from Cambridge when you were there in terms of the secrecy of the clients that you were working for?
So to your first point about non-U.S. nationals working in U.S. elections, Cambridge Analytica received formal legal advice, and which I've disclosed to the media. And that legal advice did make clear that the company should not be sending non-U.S. nationals to work on American elections. And with respect to the secrecy, everybody had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a very thorough non-disclosure agreement. And in fact, after I left, when the company engaged in a protracted legal correspondence with me, also ensured that myself and other people who decided to leave signed an undertaking of confidentiality, which is sort of a higher threshold of NDA.
You've been asked for some documents earlier, and those two you just referred to, the legal opinion about the involvement of Cambridge employees in U.S. elections.
I made it public, so it's.
If you wouldn't mind sharing it with the committee, as well as,
I'll make a
if
note
you
of it.
could, a copy of the non-disclosure agreement that you signed or others might have signed, that would be helpful too. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Hirono.
Thank you. Professor Hirsch, elections very much turn on voter turnout. So you would agree that efforts to suppress voter engagement or voter turnout should be a matter of serious concern to us.
Certainly. Okay.
You testified that it is easier to demobilize people than to mobilize them. In fact, you've testified on the impact of voter ID requirements on voter turnout. So if we were to consider regulating anything, and I realize that there are privacy issues, it's all very complicated, but if you want to focus on some kind of a regulatory scheme, should we focus on regulating ads or messages that demobilize people?
So thank you for the question. I think this issue is really complicated. Personally, I've worked as an expert witness for the ACLU and the Obama Justice Department on government voter suppression,
Yes.
voter ID laws, non-citizen voting
understand.
regulations. This is really different, and it's different because campaigns do things that are not nice all the time. If a Democratic campaign were to go and remind Trump voters of all of the moral failings in Trump's past and say, don't vote for him, is that demobilization or not? I don't know. I really don't know where that line
let's
is.
assume, I know that it's not the easiest thing to figure out whether a message actually demobilizes anybody, but let's assume that we can come up with some way to define what demobilization, because that is a matter of serious concern. You said that that is easier to effect. So that may be an area for us to pursue in terms of any kind of regulation in this very complex space that we're in right now.
That might be right. I mean, I'm not a regulatory expert. In terms of, First Amendment issues and so forth, if I were to ask someone who they're voting for and they said President Trump, and I said, don't vote for him, I'd really rather you not vote.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to me that that is a form of voter suppression, even
I know,
if
we're
it's done en
talking
masse.
about basically people paying to suppress votes. As Mr. Wylie testified, that Steve Bannon was running an operation where clients could request voter suppression messages, which they would then pay for. We're talking about a very different kind of circumstance than somebody just saying, well, don't vote for so-and-so. So I think you understand the differences. Mr. Wylie, you obviously have an awareness of the use and misuse of massive amounts of data. So I want to ask you this. The U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has proposed a new extreme vetting initiative, or life cycle vetting. Their plan is to hire a contractor to exploit publicly available information such as media, blogs, public hearings, conferences, academic websites, social media websites such as Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, to extract pertinent information regarding targets, to determine who will be a productive member of society and who will commit crimes and terrorist acts. We're talking about people who are wanting visas to come to our country. So according to the nonpartisan Brennan Center for Justice, ICE's plan would automatically flag people for deportation or visa denial based on the exact criteria from the original Muslim ban. So it was the original Muslim ban of the president that set up this extreme vetting program. And so do you think that that kind of prediction of human behavior as to whether somebody is going to become an upstanding contributing member or whether that person is likely to become a terrorist or become a criminal is even possible from the sorts of information that could be available to the U.S. government?
So 2 points to that. There is no universal definition of a bad person, and therefore it is a social construct, and it is laden with people's moral judgments. So there is no mathematical way to determine whether someone is a bad person in the abstract, in the sense that there's no universal definition of a bad person. So the second point that I would make, though, is that just because you are using data science and mathematics, you could have the most advanced neural network made yet. But if the underlying training set for that algorithm uses systemically biased information, so for example, if you're looking at criminal justice statistics and you have a model that ends up predicting that this particular African American is more likely to commit a crime because more African Americans end up in prison, you create an algorithm which is simply reflecting social and moral biases of the data sets and the people making it.
I think that the predictive value of what the government is pursuing is very questionable and problematic in terms of all kinds of issues, privacy, you name it, and the accuracy and the validity of that kind of initiative. And yet they are pursuing it, by the way. So I think it's very problematic. Professor Hirsch, would you agree that the government getting their hands on all this kind of information so that they can determine whether somebody would commit crimes or somebody's going to become an upstanding citizen? Does that even make sense to you?
No.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Booker.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wylie, I have a lot of concerns about how these platforms can be used to pit people against each other. One of the greatest values of America is this idea of indivisibility, that we have the lines that tie us together are stronger than the lines that divide us as a country. And this morning when I woke up, I listened to the New York Times podcast, which was all about Sri Lanka. The headline is "When Facebook Rumors Incite Real Violence," and it was about how the platform of Facebook was being used by sinister forces to incite hatred between groups, fear between groups, and ultimately violence in this circumstance. I was just so deeply disappointed and angered when Nigel Oakes, who's the founder of the SEL group, as you wrote, would say things in a recorded conversation where he's, it's things like this that resonate. Sometimes to attack the other group and know that you're going to lose them is going to reinforce and resonate your group, which is why Hitler attacked the Jews, because he didn't have a problem with the Jews at all. But people didn't like the Jews, so he just leveraged an artificial enemy. Well, that's exactly what Trump did. He leveraged a Muslim. Trump had the balls, and I mean really the balls, to say what people wanted to hear. This is, to me, really a frightening reality, a threat to the very ideal of a nation that wasn't founded because we all pray alike, because we all looked alike, but we had a set of common aspirations and democratic principles that united this country. Our founders talked about pledging to each other, not religious alliances, not racial alliances, but our sacred honor. And I'm wondering, first and foremost, your experience with this organization that you ultimately left. Did you look to see, did you feel that this was a manipulation of the data to prey upon divisions, prejudices, biases, inflaming them in order to produce, as demagogues often do, a certain electoral outcome?
Sure. So the United States went through a civil rights movement a couple decades ago in an attempt to desegregate society. And one of the things that we're seeing now is a resegregation of society that is catalyzed by algorithms. So some people call that echo chambers. An echo chamber is where you start to receive information from one side and you stop to see information from another side, which ultimately interferes with that common fabric, because what we're doing is we're tearing that fabric apart. With respect to what Cambridge Analytica was doing, it was looking to find ways of exploiting certain vulnerabilities in certain subsets of the population, so not everyone, certain subsets of the population, to send them information that will start to then remove them from the the public forum, if you will, where they start to see more and more conspiracy theories, or they start to see more and more vitriolic messaging, and they start to internalize that messaging, and they start to discount mainstream media. And in fact, if there's enough money being spent on targeting these individuals, they'll stop seeing any mainstream media online. And from that point, they've now been removed from the public forum. And for me, that's deeply problematic, because when you look at what democracy is supposed to be about, it's supposed to be, there's an element of common experience that voters need to have in order to collectively make a decision. If you are segregating people in terms of the information space, so that one set of voters only see one thing and another set of voters only see another thing, we have destroyed the public forum.
And I know from your statements, first of all, that was an excellent observation. And from your public statement, you talked about leaving as they're creating videos to try to inflict hatred towards Muslims, fear of Muslims. That's correct, right?
Yes. So there were videos created by the firm that were, there's no other way to describe it other than sadistic and Islamophobic.
And I have 30 seconds left, but just to shift, my colleague, Chairman Tillis, talked about Obama using big data to rally voters, which I think is, I'm somebody that also is very interested in big data and the potentials it has, predictive analytics, how they can help us with everything from empowering police officers to you name it, and we can talk about that. But the question this was stunning to me was to use big data not to rally voters, but to suppress voters based upon their racial ethnicity. And so your testimony, am I correct that you're saying that this was a determined effort to suppress not just black votes, but the votes of Asians and the votes of other ethnic minorities?
It was, as I understand it, so I didn't participate on it, but my understanding was that it was to target anybody with characteristics that would lead them to vote for the Democratic Party, including, and in particular, African Americans.
And it seemed that Mr. Bannon was particularly focused on black voters, suppressing African American voters. Do you understand where that was coming from? Did you have any insight into motivations there?
You'd have to ask Mr. Bannon about his own views.
Thank you very much.
I think we have a few more minutes. Senator Kennedy, would you be open to a 3-minute round with a hard gavel at the 3-minute mark? Senator Kennedy.
Dr. Jameson, thank you, Brittany. Dr. Jameson, I want to be sure I understand your testimony in response to answering Mr. Cruz's question. In the presidential campaign between Governor Romney and Senator Obama, of course, now,
Yes.
Now President Obama, the Facebook co-founder shared Facebook information with the Obama campaign that it didn't share with the Romney campaign because the Facebook co-founder wanted Mr. Obama to win. Is that accurate?
I didn't mean to say that. It was that Chris Hughes was working for the Obama campaign.
Who is Chris Hughes?
He was a co-founder of Facebook.
Okay.
And he was working for the Obama campaign. I don't have any information that says he took information from Facebook, but he explained to the campaign, here's how you use Facebook.
Did he share that information with Mr. Romney?
To my knowledge, no. He
Or
was
the
with
Romney
the Obama
campaign?
campaign.
Okay. And do you know why he shared this information with the Obama campaign?
Well, he actually volunteered to work for Obama when he was running for U.S. Senate, so they'd had a long relationship.
All right, so he wanted the President Obama to become President Obama?
Yes.
Okay. Here is one of the things, to me, there are two issues. Well, there are many, but there are at least two issues regarding the social media platforms. First is the privacy issue. I happen to believe that social media platforms led by Facebook have the ability to influence what we believe, how we vote, what we buy, how we feel about ourselves. And they have a responsibility to disclose that to people and how they do it. And if people still want to use Facebook, fine. I don't believe in the lottery, for example. I think it's a tax on poor people. But people understand that the odds of winning it are not great. I'm pretty libertarian. People want to pay the lottery, more power to them. But here's the problem, gentlemen, and this is the problem, Mr. Wylie, that I think we could spend several days talking about. We can all agree that poison is being spread on social media. Here's the tough part, define poison. I don't want Facebook censoring what I see. It doesn't violate, or it does violate the First Amendment if somebody wants to run an ad on Facebook that says, don't believe the mainstream media, they're biased. If you tell them they can't do that, then you don't believe in the First Amendment. Now, it's a lot different if somebody wants to run an ad that says, go kill every Rohingya Muslim that you can find in Burma. But where you draw that line is tough. If he lets you talk,
I'll let you
fine.
finish, but if you've got a great memory, we're going to take a brief recess, or I'll let you respond very quickly. We're going to take a brief recess. I'm going to run to and from the chamber, and there are at least 3 members who have asked, and we will keep it a 3-minute round.
Just
so.
30 seconds. Because I think that Senator Booker and Senator Kennedy's comments really get to my view of the heart of the matter is, which is that we have a basic human response that we are attracted to provocation and extremism, and what the platforms are doing online at the basic level is just encouraging that behavior, letting us click and share, and we're not drawn to things that are civically responsible or truthful. We're drawn to extremism, and I think to me that's the hardest part about this, is that it's not about ads. It's about what we want and want to share, and whose job it is, whether it's a cultural, a leadership, a corporate, a governmental response to that very human response we have to share things that are not necessarily nice for the world or good civic
But
things.
Professor, at some point you've got to trust people.
Yep. We're going to go into a recess. It'll probably be less than 10 minutes or as fast as I can get to and from the Capitol. So we'll stand in recess for about 10 minutes.
chat with me
I'd be
before we
happy,
the second round.
I'd be happy to answer more questions that you have, for sure.
Keep an eye out.
Yeah, I will do. All right.
Terrific. Thank you. Brilliantly done.
Well, it's not about whether it's Republican-led or Democratic-led. It's about starting to have a conversation that hasn't yet been had about the future of online platforms and how they affect people's lives and the safety and the integrity of our electoral processes around the world. And that's a really important conversation. I'm not surprised. I think the most difficult thing is the procedural time constraints because it really does with having free flow British so that we look at British debate and how there can be inquiries. There's a lot more discussion. There's a lot more answers. We have time to elaborate on the outside of our but I think it's very good that there has to be if you have more questions, feel free to send them. Sure.
We'll have the committee come back to order. And Senators Whitehouse, Klobuchar, Blumenthal are interested in a second round. I have, mainly now because I have to preside in 20 minutes. If we could keep the rounds to about 3 minutes, I would appreciate it. Or keep the each turn for about 3 minutes. And we'll start with Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Mr. Wylie, I wanted to go back to the Brexit campaign and the role that aggregate IQ played in it. In the aftermath of that campaign, a person named Dominic Cummings, who was a campaign strategist for Vote Leave, said that, tweeted out that Cambridge Analytica had a essentially 0% role in the Brexit referendum. Is that true?
So it's I don't agree with that, because AIQ was set up to service and build technology for SCL and Cambridge Analytica.
So it's true in the sense that Cambridge Analytica was the forward-facing front for this network for its American operations,
but not necessarily.
But AIQ was the front for the Brexit operations.
The AIQ was only set up to service SCL Group and Cambridge Analytica. They have intellectual property agreements that transferred their IP to Cambridge Analytica. And at the time of the Brexit referendum, they were also concurrently working with Cambridge Analytica on different projects. So to say that Cambridge Analytica didn't have any role or influence on the Brexit campaign, I think, is looking at it a little too narrowly.
In fact, you've said AIQ played an absolutely pivotal role in the overspending scheme that was set up at Vote Leave. What did you mean by the overspending scheme?
When you look at how Vote Leave transferred money from Vote Leave into a bunch of different entities, some of which it had set up, to funnel money into those schemes, and then those schemes, those campaigns all coincidentally used the same service provider, such that 40% of Vote Leave spending went to AIQ. 40% of Vote Leave spending went to AIQ.
An entity that didn't even have a website and would have been virtually impossible to find.
Despite the fact that Dom Cummings said he found them on the internet, I don't know how he would do it. He must be an incredible sleuth if he did.
There's an individual who you describe as playing a pivotal role, to use your words, in the relationship between Cambridge Analytica and Black Cube, and you refer to the same woman as playing a pivotal role in the connection of the Leave EU and Nigeria projects in which AIQ was involved. I don't know if I should bring her name into this hearing, but do you know who I'm referring to?
I know the person that you're referring to, yes.
What do you mean by pivotal role connecting Cambridge Analytica, Black Cube, the Nigeria project, and Leave EU?
The person that you're referencing joined the company and played a substantial role in setting up the company's projects in Nigeria. Which
involved Black Cube?
Which involved the procurement of hacked material. And in addition, this person was also at the, for example, press launch of Leave EU, sitting on a panel with other directors of Leave EU.
And Black Cube figured in that how? You said she was a pivotal role between the two?
She, as she testified at Parliament, she made introductions to a group of Israelis to Cambridge Analytica.
And they're the ones who work through the Black Cube corporation or entity?
You'll have to ask Cambridge Analytica and Black Cube that.
Okay.
Senator Klobuchar.
I'm going to defer to Senator Blumenthal. He's got something, and then I'll go after him.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Senator Klobuchar. Mr. Wylie, are you aware of services performed by Cambridge Analytica for American clients for free or as in-kind contributions at the expense of another entity?
Specifically, no, but what I would say to that is that the money invested by Robert Mercer in the tens of millions allowed the company, at least when I was there, to work on projects and charge clients substantially less money for the work that was being done than it would have actually cost had the client would been paying for it entirely themselves.
Your response goes back to my earlier question about the commingling of funds as an investment. In other words, characterizing money put into Cambridge Analytica as an investment rather than a contribution, and thereby used for a variety of different campaigns, but reported as a contribution for none of them, correct?
Because, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand it, one of the ancillary benefits of the setup was that whenever Mr. Mercer would invest money, it would be an investment in a company for research and development, which ultimately was for the benefit of its clients, various PACs and campaigns. But that benefit wasn't necessarily reported in whichever reporting mechanisms you have in the United States, beyond the direct payments that the campaigns were using in their contracts.
And the dangers to privacy of collecting data and regarding consumers as the product, not the customer. Their data is sold. They are, in effect, the product, and advertisers are the clients, is a very serious issue. But just to be clear here, data was, in effect, harvested or collected from Facebook, according to Facebook, without its knowledge as well. And what I would like to ask you is whether there were conversations at Cambridge Analytica about, in effect, the taking or harvesting or collecting of this data without Facebook's knowing.
So whenever you have an application, you have to submit to Facebook terms and conditions for that application. So at the time, I was aware that the terms and conditions that the app was sending, or at least what I was told, the terms and conditions that Dr. Kogan sent to Facebook did include clauses about transfers to third parties and commercialization of that data. So in effect, Facebook was being notified of, at least sort of generally, that this app is collecting data for those purposes. However, I never directly communicated with Facebook about that project until after I left the company. But my understanding is that Dr. Kogan did have conversations with Facebook. Facebook has consistently told me that they were under the impression that he was doing solely academic research, but I wasn't a party to those conversations, so you'd have to ask Facebook.
Well, in fact, in my questioning of Mark Zuckerberg, I showed him the terms of service indicating that Facebook was put on notice about the possible sale or other use of this information. And he denied knowledge of it, but you're confirming that you heard about conversations between Kogan and Facebook.
Well, I recall Dr. Kogan informing me of conversations that he had with Facebook, but I wasn't a party to those conversations. However, what I do know is that if you set up an application on Facebook, you have to submit the terms and conditions of your app for review before Facebook lets you activate that application, which was, as I understand it, the case for this application, which meant that Facebook was notified, at least via the app review process, that there was some intent of transferring or commercializing the information. Whether or not they bothered to read the terms and conditions, sort of like how many users don't read Facebook's own terms and conditions, is another matter, though.
Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Professor Hirsch, you and I were talking on the break there about this disengagement issue and following up on Senator Hirono's questions. And I pointed out that while you can have a negative ads, and I don't think that is exactly what Mr. Wylie is referring to about disengagement, you do have blatant examples from ads that were bought with Russian money or through other parties from this last election that actually are blatant criminal violations because they tell people to vote with the African American face, you know, save time or avoid the lines and text 35423 and you can vote. Now, do you consider that disengagement?
Yeah, that seems terrible and you know, hopefully legal if it's not. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to clear up that there are gray areas. There are areas that you probably would say are just persuasion, and then there are areas that are pure illegal. But of course, using foreign money to influence an election is illegal on its face to begin with. You would agree with that?
I agree, yeah. It's helpful to clarify the issues.
All right, thank you. Mr. Wylie, in addition to the improper access by Cambridge Analytica, we've also heard about the misuse of user data by other analytics firms like CubeU, which sold data that it gained from quizzes that had been misleadingly labeled for nonprofit academic research. Facebook has acknowledged that we will hear more about incidents like these. My question to you is, what do we know about the scope of the problem here? How many more Cambridge Analyticas are out there?
That's a question that actually only Facebook can answer. And, you know, it's interesting that their behavior before the story broke was to threaten to sue The Guardian. They then banned me as a whistleblower from their platform. I think in part because, you know, this may be highlighting a systemic problem that not only Facebook experiences, but I suspect other social media platforms do as well. And that's why we need rules for transparency.
Exactly. So we were just talking about that it is, as much as Facebook has been the focus and Mark Zuckerberg testified, in some ways, with the online political ads, they've agreed to go further than some of the other companies, leading us in terms of disclosure and disclaimers. So do you think that if you just have, and I know I asked this before, but could you elaborate on just having a few companies out there doing different things, how that is not going to lend itself in the future to rules of the road? Because in my mind, you're going to have companies emerge that are more blatantly violating the rules, stuff goes over there, political ads go over here, and that you must have not only privacy rules in place, but some rules of the road when it comes to political ads. Could you elaborate on that answer?
I mean, we don't allow you know, car companies to make unsafe cars and just put terms and conditions on the outside of that car. We require seat belts in all cars, and because it's important for safety. And when you look at industries that are important, you know, cars, food, medicine, nuclear power, airlines, we have rules that require safety and to put consumers first, because, you know, it's very difficult for Americans to get around if they don't have a car, and so therefore that car should be safe. It's very difficult for people to survive without food, so therefore that food should be safe. And in the 21st century, it is nearly impossible for people to be functional in the workplace and in society more at large without the use of the internet.
Okay.
So absolutely, if this is something that affects everybody every day, then there should be some degree of accountability and public oversight.
Speaking of which, and then I will end here, but you and I were discussing on the break algorithms and the changes that we've seen, the great changes. So Facebook made some changes a few months ago. I've always found it a useful platform to do some things that aren't as caustic, actually, as we see in our politics. Whether it's engagement about veterans issues or it's something about I do a photo contest with all the people in my state. It's been a very positive thing. They get to display their photos and things like that, or you name it. And I've seen a dramatic change in those kinds of more moderate posts about doing things with Republicans, for instance. Senator, those including our burn pit bill, a dramatic change in those kinds of posts in this change in algorithm. And to me, it seems like, and we should have a hearing on this alone, I think, that I'm not certain that those companies should be deciding what political speech gets exposed. It seems like the most volatile. I get on Twitter when I do a post and you get more base retweets if it's really volatile. But Facebook, it's just been a dramatic change on the way the posts are being shared and who's commenting. Because I have the numbers. I've done my own little sting operation, as pathetic as it is, to check different posts on different days from before this change in algorithm. And I know it's happening to me, and I've heard other members saying it's happening to them. And to me, this is free speech in our own democracy as opposed to the Russians. Obviously, I'm going to talk to Facebook about it. I still think it's an incredible platform. I want it to work for everyone. But could you just comment about this change in algorithms recently and what kind of speech that has reinforced?
Sure. So the first thing that I would say is that the concern that you have has to do with distortion, right? And when we look at what other sectors we regulate, for example, in financial markets or in mergers and acquisitions and competition, if there's potential disruptive distortions in the market, we regulate that. And what you're talking about is distortion in the access to information that people have and the engagement with that information, which arguably is even more important because it's the information that we consume to know what's happening around the world. So in terms of the specifics with respect to the changes in algorithms, Facebook is still a company, and therefore it creates algorithms which prioritize paid engagement and penalize organic engagement. And even when it's looking at what pieces of information to show or not show your friend network or your followers, things that the algorithms suspect are going to induce more clicks are prioritized. As the professor was saying before,
they made a change in that somehow so that it's become more exacerbated. So.
Yes, because the other thing you have to understand about algorithms is that they have no awareness. They just continue to optimize until they're told to stop, right? So again, getting back to oversight, somebody at some point has to look at that and tell a company that's managing those algorithms what is appropriate and not appropriate to prioritize and not prioritize.
Because the message I'm getting is if you're going to do a more sort of moderate, policy-oriented post, you better pay for that to get that out there. Because, or if you want to do a really polarizing post, they're gonna prioritize that. And I get that things go viral. I understand all that. I write my own tweets, blah blah. But I'm telling you that that something has dramatically changed, and I'm hoping that they will look at that.
And if I may, because my final comments are going to relate to this. I think a part of what we have to talk about. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Part of what we have to talk about is these models came up with a purely ad-based revenue stream. I found it surprising that we had a member here who was somehow offended by the idea that maybe the next generation model is having someone who engages on any social media platform to, as they do with Pandora, say, I pay a certain fee and I get no ads. I get none of that engagement that would be the target of these algorithms. So we have to make sure that as we go through these social media platforms, that suddenly we don't make them. I'm somewhere between Professor Hirsch and Mr. Wylie on just how much we need social media to be a functioning society.
But I wasn't talking about paid ads. I'm talking about a company deciding how they're going to amplify unpaid.
But if I may finish, all of that targeting at the end of the day creates an interaction that goes beyond the organic interaction that would come by virtue of someone deciding to engage with you in whatever group that is. And so it would never become relevant if the industry moves to that model. But we have to have a thoughtful conversation around this if we want to continue to have growing social media platforms, because we can talk about all the bad they've done, but I could also talk about lives that they've saved and crowdsourcing that they've been responsible for that has literally fed people and prevented suicides. So there's a good social outcome from these platforms, but they're going to have to move to a different model in order to sustain themselves and to provide people who want to engage a safer path of interaction. I'd like, if I may, I'd like to offer for the record, without objection, a couple of the articles that I mentioned that were from the MIT Technology Review. They were written, I think, in 2012, and they're not taking an opinion, but they're talking about some of the uses of these tools and things that we should be mindful of as we're crafting legislation. And then I also wanted to offer for the record, it's an editorial. I don't know that I agree with all the conclusions in the editorial, but they do have quotes in there that have been referenced, in fact, that I think are also important for people who want to come with a thoughtful outcome, to the extent the government has to get involved and address some of the issues that I think have been legitimately, so without objection, they'll be submitted for the record, have been legitimately brought up. Thank you for the extended hearing and the time on the committee. We welcome your feedback, and certainly you should be tracking what we're doing here to form your own opinions about whether or not they're helpful or harmful to addressing some of the issues and then the future of these platforms. This meeting is adjourned.